So I first met Ayodh not in person, but strangely enough, after writing the very first blog post on the MakeLab blog, where I used the phrase digital vernacular, which ultimately became the title of my book. But I had said it out loud once in front of Ralph Nelson, and he helped me figure out maybe what it meant. And then I wrote a very brief blog post about it. And my blog is fairly well followed, and I would get lots of "that's cool" and "like" and things like that as comments. But then this guy writes this like 3-page response in incredible detail about what he thought of my blog post. And I'm like, who the hell is this guy? And then I looked him up, and I found out it was Ayodh Kamath. And from that, I started following his work. And maybe 3 years after that, we were both in New Delhi together doing a project which I feel like fell in line with some of the ideas I wrote about, but really more influenced by his work in this area. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ayodh Kamath and some of the interesting things about him. Ayodh started out his architectural education where he received his bachelor's of architecture at Shashant School of Art and Architecture, and that's in a suburb of New Delhi. He found his way to Boston at MIT, where he received a master's in science and architecture and computational architecture. He not only is an assistant professor here at Lawrence Tech, but he's also a partner in the architecture firm Kamath Design Studio in New Delhi, India. And with that, I give you Ayodh Kamath.
Okay, so I've never worn one of these mics before, so just let me know if you can hear me or not hear me. Is this clear? Am I audible at the back? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the lecture committee and for setting this up. It was a bit unexpected because this was supposed to be a sort of gallery talk with 10 or 15 people in the brick gallery, and then it became this last week. So anyway, so the title of my talk today is Computationally Reclaiming Material, and I'm not sure if any of you have had a chance to look at the boards up at the brick gallery, because there the title is Digitally Reclaiming Material, and then I decided to switch that over, and you'll see why as I get into the talk. So, I mean, and as you can see in this image, the talk starts in Detroit and starts with blight in Detroit. And one of the issues with blight in Detroit is that the more the blight there is and the fewer occupied houses there are, the harder it is to provide infrastructure to the houses which are still occupied because of low density and various other reasons. I mean, that's something I'm guessing most of us in this room here especially are already familiar with. So now a popular response to blight is the idea of reclaiming material. And what that means is that you take material from abandoned houses and you use that in houses. You use that to build new houses or to refurbish existing houses. But unfortunately, most reclaimed material gets downcycled, and what I mean by downcycled is that there's a reduction in the utility and the value of the material when it's reused. Let's see. So the reason for this is that while a new house is built out of standardized material, what comes out after when you reclaim material from an abandoned house is material that's been modified and been made non-standard and unpredictable. So what you then need to do is that you need to re-standardize it and before it can be reused. And most of the time this re-standardization process means that you have to trim the material, cut it, and modify it in other ways which reduce its utility and value. So what was once a house now becomes a countertop, a tabletop, or a candle stand, right? So when I moved to Detroit, one of the questions and learned about material reclamation here, one of the questions I asked myself was, is there a way to upcycle material rather than to downcycle it? And what this might do is that it will enable you to use material from abandoned houses, and rather than make candle stands and tabletops, can you then make bus stops, benches, pavilions, and infrastructure that's lacking in the city. So instead of standardizing reclaimed material, I started with some non-structural fencing posts, and what I did was I removed only those parts which were unusable, because the bits that were cracked or had nails or knots in them. And so what I was left with was a whole bunch of non-standard pieces of wood, and so I took measuring tape and I measured the length, breadth, height of each of those pieces and recorded that. Then I experimented with different ways of joining pieces together with tolerances and other things, and I decided to build a parabolic arch. And a parabolic arch, unlike a circular arch, has non-standard curvature. So what I did was that I matched the variations in the curvature of the arch to variations in the length of pieces. So the shorter pieces went where the arch was more curved, and the longer pieces went where the arch was flatter. And then I also matched the depth of the pieces to the amount of deflection at different points in the arch. So at the top there's more deflection, so the pieces are deeper. At the bottom there's less deflection, so the pieces are shallower there. And this is what the arch looked like. It had a span of about 6 feet, and I think it's about 2.5 feet high. And so then what I did next was that I designed a grid shell, which is basically a set of arches which are intersecting each other at right angles. So it's arches going this way and that way. So because I was now dealing with a lot more pieces of wood and a lot more arches, I converted the simple logic which I had used in my head to build the arch, and I converted that into an automated computer algorithm that again used length and depth, and found the best position for a particular piece in a grid shell based on the curvature of the grid shell and the amount of deflection. And this was how the intersecting arches joined, and that's a 3D model of the analysis and what the grid shell was supposed to look like. And this was the actual grid shell, which I'm not sure if any of you remember this. It was out near the pod last semester. So, and this was about 7 feet wide, or 6.5 feet wide, 6.5 feet tall. So just enough to qualify as a bus shelter for someone of my size, or it could be a pavilion in a park or something like that, right? Now each joint, because each piece of wood was different and each connection was different and was a result of the algorithm doing its thing. And the joints were all friction fit joints, so that the pieces could be easily assembled as well as disassembled, so that the pieces could be used for something else, which I believe did happen over the summer, so it worked. So now with this structure, I was able to upcycle material because the computer algorithm was able to tackle the different sized members without needing to standardize them and reduce their utility and value. So the non-structural fencing posts then were used to build a grid shell structure. Now, so the reason I switched the title of my talk from digitally reclaimed material to computationally reclaimed material is because all computation doesn't have to be digital. So computation is not just what happens inside a CPU, but it can but computation, I mean, to me, is simply the manipulation of information. If you're manipulating information, you're computing. So for example, let's see, does this play? Okay, yeah, so here you see this man weaving a basket from twigs and leaves. And each leaf is different, each stick in the framework of the basket is different, and he needs to process a lot of information to figure out how exactly to arrange the leaves, where to fix them to the framework, and all the other stuff that's going on in this weaving process. But it's not only the human being that's computing here, because if you look at the leaves, they are in groups, they grow in groups of 3. Right, so let's see, does he put, yeah, there you go. So he's putting this next set of leaves in, they grow in groups of 3. He's going, yeah, there. And he's then arranging each of the 3 leaves as they grow, right? And so how is it that the leaves are always in groups of 3? That's because the information in the genes of the plant or the tree that these leaves came from, that information was expressed in the growth of the tree in the form of leaves which always occur in groups of 3. So in the making of that basket, it wasn't just the human, but it was also the tree that was computing or processing information, right? So now I'm going to move from humans and plants to insects. So this is a paper wasp, which and these wasps build nests by sort of scraping material off plant leaves and stems and chewing up that material, mixing it with enzymes in their saliva and making a little ball of paper pulp. Then they take that paper pulp in their mouth, they fly to their nest, and then they place that paper pulp on their nest to build a nest which looks something like this with sort of nearly identical hexagonal cells. And researchers at Harvard University have studied how wasps and termites build their nests, and they've developed robots which build structures in the same way. This is from some years ago, it's not even new. So I'll just play that for a short while. So I mean, termites do much the same thing as the wasps but just instead of plant material, they collect mud and mix that with enzymes into little bricks. So wasps have balls of paper pulp, and the termites have little clay bricks that they make. And so, yeah, so these robots use these, in this case, you are using these tiles. And the thing here is that in the case of the termites and the wasps and these robots, the individual's building, so the individual wasp, the individual ant, the individual robot doesn't have an idea of the whole that they are building. Each of them doesn't have a little set of construction drawings in their brain. All that they have is a set of simple rules, like if I see a brick or a tile or a drop of paper pulp here, then what I do is I lay the next one to the right of it. So it's something as simple as that. I mean, that's not a real rule, it's just a hypothetical rule, but something as simple as that. And so, for example, when wasps are building their hexagonal cells, there might be a rule that says that, okay, if you encounter a wall of a certain length, then you start building a new wall at 120 degrees from that. Right? So now if the wasp keeps doing that 6 times, it will get a hexagonal cell automatically, but in the brain of the wasp, there isn't any representation of a hexagon that it needs to build. So And this form of computation that the wasps, the termites, and these Harvard robots use is called stigmergic computation. And as much as I hate terminology, I'll just talk about what that involves. So the individual stigmergic agents, which would be the individual wasp, the termite, or the robots, again, they have only simple behavioral rules in their memory that tells them to respond in fixed ways to specific information in their environment. So like I said, if there's a wall that's X length, then start a new wall 120 degrees from it, right? So that's all. So what they do is that, so an agent perceives some information in its environment, it acts on that information and processes it in its brain, and then the output information is put back in the environment through a physical modification of that environment, right? So if a wasp sees a little blob of paper pulp there, it checks back to the rule in its brain and it says, okay, put another ball of paper pulp to the right of that, right? So it's perceived some information, it's processed that based on a rule, and then the output of that rule is expressed in the form of a physical modification of the environment. And then you can have, and these agents can act in tandem, one after another sequentially, to perform different steps in a computation. And this iterative process of perception and action is called a perception action loop, and it allows stigmergic agents to collaboratively compute without the need to exchange information through language or any other direct form. So I find information in the environment, I process it, I act on the environment, and the next agent comes along, or it could be me in the future when I've already forgotten what I've done, which happens often, and then that new agent perceives that information, processes it, further modifies the environment, and it keeps going that way. Right? And that's not as weird as you think, because if you look at it at a fundamental level, as I'm talking to you now, I'm doing precisely that, because what am I doing? I'm modifying the pressure of the air in front of me with my mouth, and that environmental modification is being perceived by your ears in the form of your eardrums vibrating, and then that's going into your brain, right? So in some senses, any form of information exchange through a medium is a stigmergic sort of exchange. So anyway, so now I'm going to move from wasps and termites to another species of insect that also performs stigmergic computation, but somewhat differently. So this is the nest of a weaver ant. I don't know if you can notice, the leaves are kind of bunched together in the middle. That's the nest. And so how the weaver ants build these nests are the teams of worker ants pull and hold together edges of leaves, and then other workers squeeze the larvae of the colony to stimulate them to produce silk, and then they hold these larvae, which are squirting out silk like a shuttle, between the two leaves, and they weave that together to stick them, right? So compared to the wasps, now the ants need to process a lot more information about their environment, because the ants need to be aware of the size of the leaf, the shape, its position on the tree, how flexible it might be, and then it needs to correlate that information with the requirements of the nest, which would include a chamber for the queen, chambers for the larvae, chambers to store food, and then an outer protective layer. So there's a lot more information that these ants are processing compared to the wasps. But on the other hand, the ants are using much less material. So in a sense, you can think of the wasps as downcycling the plant material that they use, because there's a perfectly good stem or a leaf, they scrape that off, chew it into a uniform pulp, and build uniform hexagonal cells. The ants, on the other hand, are upcycling these leaves because they're using the existing structure and shape and location of the leaf, and they're adding only a little bit of silk between the leaves, right? So from the perspective of the ants, the value and utility of the leaves is going up when they build the nest, right? And they're using much less material in the process. So those of you who were here at last week's talk will recognize this person as David Pye, and he sort of he classified workmanship into the workmanship of risk and the workmanship of certainty, and applying this to the wasp and the ant, you would call what the wasp does the workmanship of certainty, because the material which it's working with is uniform paper pulp. The shapes that it's producing are uniform hexagons. So there's very little risk involved. You know what you're getting, you know what you're using, you know what you're getting. While with the ants, their nest building strategy is far more risky, because the ant has no control over the tree and the precise shape of the leaves or their locations or any of that. But it's a far bigger gamble that the ant is taking to build its nest the way it does compared to the wasp. So in the same, one more thing is that, wait, where was I? Sorry, I'm a little lost. Okay, I'll just go straight on, it's fine. It'll come to me at some point, and then I'll probably jump back to that slide. Anyway, so we generally think of ants and wasps and other insects as these automatons which are following pre-programmed genetic behavioral rules. So, but can there be creativity in stigmergic processes? And according to this man, who is Jürgen Schmidhuber, he's a Swiss-German computer scientist, it is possible. And it becomes possible for a stigmergic agent to be creative if it is able to modify the rules of its own behavior, right? So according to Schmidhuber, okay, I'll just read out this. So creativity, according to Schmidhuber, is the desire and the ability of an agent to improve its own internal model of the environment to better predict the results of its actions. So think of this as, okay, to borrow Professor Adhya's example of a child learning to walk. As a child is learning to walk or learning to cycle or anything, as it does the action again and again, it's better able to predict what will happen when it moves its body in a certain way, right? So as it's able to better predict the outcomes of its actions, it's able to learn, and more of its behavior is predictable and it's less risky. Now moving back to the diagrams, the action of a stigmergic agent will have some effects on the environment that the agent is able to predict, and some effects that the agent is not able to predict. So the predictable ones are environment P, the environmental effects which are predictable, and environment U are the effects which are unpredictable, right? But an agent in a stigmergic process can learn about these unpredictable actions by perceiving the effect on the environment. So even if so for example, if I crumple up my notes here and I throw them there, I'm not 100% sure where they're going to land, right? Beforehand, I don't know. So that's an unpredictable outcome of my action. But then once I've thrown it and it's landed somewhere, then I can walk up there, find it, and then I know where the crumpled up notes fell, right? So in my second step of stigmergy, I can, by perceiving the result of my previously unpredictable action, I then know what I've done, right? So now, so creativity and learning come in when, if I throw my notes enough times and I find where they land, I will then know, I'll then have a much better idea of how much force to throw it with, and so if I don't like someone's face in the audience, I can then aim and throw and I hit them, right? So that is, so if I'm able to do that, that is creative, that then I'm learning about and I'm being able to better predict the results of my actions. So once again, this diagram collapses the previous steps into a single one. And right, so while the wasp is not able to perceive as much information in its environment as the ant, instead what the wasp does is it modifies its environment to better match its simplistic internal model of the environment. So the wasp's internal model of the environment is relatively simple, because it mostly has to deal with uniform lumps of paper pulp. And the wasp's internal model of the environment doesn't include the shape of leaves, the size of leaves, the position of leaves, their flexibility, none of that stuff. So instead, what the wasp does is that it modifies the environment to match its internal model, right? And the strategies of the wasp and the ant are much like the strategies of conventional material reclamation and computational reclamation. So, so the wasp chews up the paper into uniform little paper pulp drops, and here you reclaim material, chop it up into uniform blocks. The ant perceives all the various, perceives a lot more information in the environment, and similarly, and is able to compute all that information, and similarly, you can, you can measure pieces of wood and put those into an algorithm which then processes that information and creates an output. So, but unlike insects, humans can and do learn and modify their behavior in real time without having to wait multiple generations. So because, and what I mean by that is that a wasp or an ant's behavior is pre-programmed into the genes. So the only way that it can modify that is if it reproduces the genes, it swaps genes, and there is a new set of genes in the next generation, and therefore there are new forms of behavior in the next generation, right? That's the only way that a wasp or an ant can learn. But humans don't have to wait multiple generations. We have a brain which can process, which is more flexible, which can process more information. So we can learn in real time. So if I throw this paper enough times within this talk, I will have better aim at the end. I don't have to wait for my grandchildren to be better throwers, right? So anyway, so this is a family of the Baiga tribe in central India building a house. So as you can see, the house is made up of branches and twigs. The points where the tree branches or forks are where the beams rest on columns. So the builders of this house have to perceive or have to record this information about the tree and cut a specific tree based on the way it's branching, its size, its shape, and then use that to build the house, right? So this diagram sort of shows you all the various stigmergic agents and the flows of material and information that take place to build that house. So, for example, Baigas practice a form of shifting agriculture and forest stewardship called Bewar cultivation, where patches of forest are cleared for a few seasons of cultivation and then allowed to regenerate. So, and it's from these forests that the trees would be harvested. Then the tree itself has its own genome, it has other symbiotic organisms in the forest, it has sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, nutrients, oxygen, and various, then it photosynthesizes, it throws out oxygen, and in the process it grows. Now, So that's the tree. Then the builder of the house sort of goes into the forest. It finds this tree which is grown in a specific way. They perceive the form and the shape and the size of that tree. Then they choose a specific tree. Then they cut it down. Then they strip the bark off the tree. Then put it in the ground and sort of build their house, right? So these are all the steps that go into steps of information processing that go into building that house. So, so in order to learn to build a house, a Baiga individual would develop skills over their lifetime and creatively respond to their environment, right? So, and through the workmanship of risk. So this is so this is the same as the earlier diagram I showed. I just swapped agent for craftsman and craftsperson, sorry, right? And yeah, that and but humans, unlike insects, can actually exchange information directly and talk to each other and write things down, make drawings and all of that. So when humans do that, or when individuals in a society begin to exchange information, this develops into a technology which is nothing but a set of shared skills, and that's what technology kind of boils down to. And I didn't say that, this was said by a French philosopher whose name I can't pronounce. Right, so the diagram on the left there collapses the individuals who make up a society into one entity, which is the society, the whole society. And you can see, just as the individual members of that society are individually performing stigmergic computations, the society as a whole can also be thought to be involved in a stigmergic computation where it is where the technology of that society is evolving to better suit its environment. Yeah, so the diagram on the left collapses those three circles in the middle. You get the diagram on the right, and the diagram on the right matches this previous diagram down here, right? Same shape, same process. Now that was craft, so now let's move to design and industrial production. Now, compared to the Baiga house, which is made out of varied unpredictable material, this house made from dimensional lumber involves the workmanship of certainty. You know, 2x6 is a 2x, okay, no, 2x6 is not actually 2 inches by 6 inches, but you get the idea, right? So now, because design and construction are separate activities here, the framer has to follow the construction documents and building codes and has little room for creative risk-taking on the job. So, and in order to facilitate this, the framer has to be provided with lumber of standardized dimensions, just like the wasp uses standardized drops of paper pulp. Yeah. So the comparison between the dimensional lumber house and the non-dimensional timber house is again similar to the wasp and the ant, or conventional material reclamation and the computational reclamation. Now, this is Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate, and that's a book by him called The Sciences of the Artificial. And in that book, he talks about how in industrialized societies one can divide disciplines into natural sciences, which study the natural world like physics, chemistry, and biology, and artificial sciences, which study human-made phenomena like engineering, which studies machines, architecture, which studies buildings, and law, which studies law, that kind of thing. So, in an industrial society, the actions of the worker are dictated by information generated by scientists, engineers, and designers. At the level of the individual worker, the worker's actions have no feedback mechanism to affect the information that they are mandated to follow. right? So if I'm sitting there nailing 2x4s on a building site, I have no way of changing the international building code, right? But if I'm a Baiga tribal building my house, if something doesn't feel right to me, or if I get an idea or think of a way of doing something better, I can just immediately do that, right? And I can take risks. My idea may work, it may not work, right? Okay, so right, so the workers in an industrial society are not really stigmergic agents because they can't respond to information in their environment. They're forced to respond to information which is given to them by other people in their society. So, and similarly, the industrial society, so this is industrial society as a whole. That is the workmanship of certainty, where these prescriptive codes in the form of design codes and the design that is produced by an architect is what the workman on site follows. Not, I mean, there is some amount of perception and action with respect to materials. So I mean, I don't have the skills or the knowledge to frame a house, so I couldn't do this. So there is skill involved, but that's relatively less compared to what you could do. And then if you look at the diagram on the top, that is this diagram with all the individuals in an industrial society collapsed together. Now here again, that is not stigmergic, because while the scientists who are gathering information about the natural world, the actions of industry are what is classified as the artificial world, right? So scientists are to illustrate that, scientists are far less likely to listen to engineers or architects, while architects and engineers are far more likely to listen to what scientists say or discover, right? So, yeah. But these two people argue that the division between the natural world and the artificial world is a false one. So this is Professor Eugene Stormer and Paul Crutzen, who also has a Nobel Prize. And anyway, they coined and popularized the term Anthropocene, which describes the industrial era as being one where human actions influence the natural world in significant ways, such as by converting large reserves of hydrocarbons in the ground into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or by releasing CFCs to deplete the ozone layer, right? So they argue that the division between the natural and the artificial there isn't a division, and that the actions of people affect the natural world. So it is one thing. And if we in the diagram, if we then unite natural and artificial environments into a single anthropocenic environment, which is environment A, then society again becomes stigmergic, because it is this, because you are immediately because society as a whole is reacting to whatever it's doing to the environment directly, which is something we need to do now with climate change and not enough oil and that kind of stuff. So, however, in this, the individual worker is still not a stigmergic agent, because regardless of global warming and floods and the next apocalypse, on site I still need to follow the construction drawings and the building codes, right? So the next thing is, are there alternative ways of manipulating information and material in the world? So I would argue that the project that I started this talk with displays one alternative where the design responds directly to information in the material environment. So this is a diagram of all the steps which went into making that grid shell. I'm wondering if I should talk you through it or I don't even know, is it even clear and legible at the back? No, okay, so then, okay, there are a lot of steps there. Yeah. But a far more powerful example of an alternative is the Fab Tree Hab, which was house proposed by Mitchell Joachim. I don't know his website tells you how to pronounce it. I couldn't figure even that. Joachim. Okay, thank you. So he was in, and him and his firm were in the critical practice studio over the summer, which I unfortunately was not there for. But anyway, so in this Fab Tree Hab project, basically what happens is that it involves designing digitally fabricated formwork, which you use to shape the growth of a tree into a house. And then for the internal walls, you just build mud walls, because that's anyway protected from the elements. So it doesn't have to be water resistant or anything, particularly water resistant or anything. So if you draw a diagram of what's going on there, then the various agents, so the tree, the human, the various human agents, the environment, the scientist, the designer, everyone is sort of mutually exchanging information to create this house. And so this information, the way information material flows here is very different from, let's say, this, where information and material flows, but information doesn't flow because you're standardizing material from your environment. So again, this is the wasp, and this is, oh sorry, last slide. That is the ant. So, yep. Thank you. Any questions?
So we have time for questions. Are there any ant advocates or wasp advocates out there? Yeah.
Well, I may have missed something. I probably did, but it's interesting that you're talking about wasps and ants, because I was thinking of this quote of Marx where he talks about ants are like weavers and bees are like architects, but what separates the best of ants from the worst of architects is that the architect has a vision of what they want to do. I mean, this is an exact quote, but he does in fact use ants and architects as part of the quote, and it's that they both, take natural material and translate it into something else. But what separates them is that humans, through that act, realize their own purpose. And I guess what I'm missing from the project is, it seems so positivistic, and it seems so much based on so formative with a capital P, and I'm just wondering where, for instance, when you make an arch out of this, or make structures out of reclaimed material, where is the purpose that might be embedded in that material? That's something that built the house based on all these economies and issues of domesticity and so forth. And then when you take it and translate it, it seems to me that you're maybe ridding it of that history, that the purpose that the material originally had in some ways, culturally. Does that make any sense?
No, I get the question, and I'm actually glad you asked that, because that's something I didn't touch on here, and that aspect of design is not something I'm very good at dealing with in words myself. But I wonder if So I mean, if one looks at this reclaimed tabletop, then a lot of sorry, I'm not on. Oops. Oh God, now I'm the first. Sorry. Right. So if you look at this reclaimed tabletop here, there is I would argue that there is information embedded in that material about the habitation of that house over however many years it was inhabited, all the people, and where you nailed a specific picture of a relative who may have passed away, or when there was a fire which was put out in time, or whatever happened to the house after it was abandoned as it decayed. All that information is embedded in that material, right? But in this tabletop, I would argue that all that information, all that history is trivialized because it's not being used. It's just sitting there as a tabletop. Whereas in here, I may not be recording all that information, but in the form of the 161.1612 into 24 into 242 into 22 millimeters, that number is representative of that history, because that number came from the way it was used, and those sets of numbers and that information goes into creating the specific place where a particular piece of wood went into that grid shell and the role that it's performing structurally, functionally in there. So I don't know if that helps to answer that in some way, and if you then look at so if you look at, this diagram isn't legible, but I can kind of, I'll have to carry my laptop. Oh no, that's, wait, there, this was, sorry, function F4, duplicate, boom. Okay, now I have a cursor, good. So this is the framer who's put together the house out of dimensional lumber. This is the house. This is the usage and the decay of that house, and that information from that is going is being processed by the reclaimer. So when I'm reclaiming a piece of material, I have to specifically remove it where it had been nailed, or chop off a part of it where there was a knot, which the original framer, at the time for original framing it was okay, but then it's kind of, the knot's loosened out, it's popped out, and there's a gaping hole in my piece of wood. I need to respond to all those things, and so all that information is preserved in the making of something like this. And in the making of something like this, it's even more apparent, because the growth of the tree and the house that somebody wants to live in, their goals are sort of converging into one, and they're collaborating with each other. So I don't know if that makes much sense, because these are aspects which I'm not very good at expressing. I don't know, did I get the question at all? Or did I go off on a tangent? I'm sorry.
My question had a couple of tangents.
Okay.
Correct?
Sorry.
Yeah, so in the first project that you started with the parabolic dome, all those pieces that you had, did you have to manually choose where those pieces went and then
No.
did the calculations, or you just put in all the information at once and your script manually told you which piece was best in which position?
The second one.
Okay.
The second one. So I had an Excel sheet with length, breadth, height, which formed the input for the script, and then the script based on the algorithm, it decided which piece was best to placed where in that.
And was there a limit to it? Did it use all the pieces, or did it only use the ones that it figured was best?
It only used the ones which were best. I mean, that's one thing. I tested it with like smaller and smaller numbers of pieces, and I didn't program the algorithm in enough depth for it to tell me that, okay, look, this cannot be done. I mean, the poor thing would sit there and try and piece together something, and the only time it would stop is if it ran out of pieces completely. But I mean, that's not something that isn't possible to. You can program that in, I suppose. Sorry.
So, first of all, compliment clearly delivering something that's rather complicated, and also your focus of the work. I greatly appreciate. It seems from the time that you developed an argument around upcycling being attached to structure, right? And so that when you measure a piece of wood, because wood's structural capacity is very much attached to its size, right? Everything is fits. Are you anticipating moving forward that ideas of cladding, which is not the same measure, right? That all set of dimensions complemented by other elements?
Right.
Well, that ideas of cladding, keeping rain off, holding a body off, or
Right.
other things that a bus stop does, those things would be similarly positioned. And if so, would you envision that the structure would maintain its kind of place at the top of the heap in the hierarchy, or how would you choreograph the relationship? Like where it's a piece of wood that's ideal for structure and for cladding, for example, the two algorithms like fighting for this chunk of wood or something.
Actually, that's a great question, and actually the algorithm which I wrote doesn't care what the shape is. It just puts shape, it matches length to curvature, and so the structural aspect of this was actually something that I did independently in different structural software, and I calculated one surface, the surface of the shell or the grid shell, and then a deflected surface if there's load applied on it. I gave my algorithm just the two surfaces and said, okay, now jam wood in between these two surfaces as best as possible. So I could theoretically have given it any random non-structural shape of my choice, and it would have done the same thing. So in this particular case, it was my personal choice to match the attributes of the wood to structural performance, but it could as easily have been an expressive sculptural shape which responded formally or aesthetically to a specific context, and I could also extend that to other issues of creating shelter, like you said, throwing off rain, view, or protection from wind, any other thing. And yes, that should be possible, and that would need and you'd need to basically set up what your rules are, program them, and execute that. It's not. This is the structural aspect of this was purely my personal choice in this case.
Any questions?
And sorry, go ahead.
What do you think is the hardest part about like upcycling materials?
No. Okay, the toughest part here in this project was that because each piece of wood was chosen by the algorithm to fit in a specific place, if something happened to that piece of wood while cutting it, if it cracked, if it chipped, if it snapped, then I had to find a replacement which wouldn't be as efficient, right? So each piece was, so unlike in a brick wall, if one brick isn't right or if it breaks while you're building your wall, you can just swap it out with another brick. Here I couldn't do that, and that is something that I guess, I'm not sure if it's just a mindset change that I need, or if there's some way to better improve that. And more than a couple of pieces actually did snap and break here. So what I then did was that I manually sifted through my the pile of wood and I chose the one with the closest dimensions and used that instead. Yeah, so I just sifted through here, and which is why it's ordered in size, so I could find an alternative piece easily. So for me, that was the hardest thing to kind of get to grips with, because material becomes that much more valuable if it has a unique spot in the thing that you're designing.
So I'm not an entomologist, but he seems to know a lot about the ants and the wasps. So in the case of the ants, they optimize the right leaves and the right kind of foliage, and they make their nest. And then once that hatchery is successfully raised a whole bunch of ants, what happens? Do they use that site over and over again, or do they go on and find another site?
That's a great question. My only association with this species of ant was for a high school biology project, and that did not go into that much depth. My only association with the wasps is that I've been stung by them, so that's even less. But that's a great question, and I don't. And that's. I mean, the one. Entomologist, sorry, etymology is word origins, entomology is right, insects. So the only entomologist who are like, all my information about these ants comes from the famous Harvard entomologist Edward O. Wilson, who had, from his early career, then later he had sociobiology and all of that stuff, which became a little crazy. So.
Because there are elements of the assumption is that if some of these leaves is fairly benign, and then this part of the tree is able to return or never
okay. Right.
And be continuous participant in the larger system, that's really terrific. So it's done a number of things, but it's never like the wasps, when they take that cellulose material and they remove it from the contents. It serves their purposes because the ants or the wasps are looking to preserve their genetic line and pass them all that good stuff. But the nest it's a dead end.
Right.
So your particular interest in taking the structural function of the wood and giving it a further existence as structural material is like a continuation of its process. We cut down the tree. We did that. We can't reverse that. So. The continued life, I guess, in the system. How long have you pushed them if you're following it around?
Okay, so that I do know a study about these ants on that, where somebody measured the efficiency of photosynthesis of the leaves which were used for a nest, and the life of the nest in the case of the ants is as long as the leaves are stuck to the tree. As soon as the leaves are shed, then the nest falls off, and then that's the end of that nest. And I think what that study found was that the efficiency reduces of the leaves involved in a nest or incorporated into a nest drops from 100 to about 70% or something like that. And if I remember right, the study was inconclusive about the life of the leaves being stuck to the branch, and I don't think it said, they weren't sure yet if it shed faster or not. Yeah.
I'm going to be selfish and ask the last question. And it's an easy one because I think it's mostly observational on your part. In one of the diagrams where you were discussing the craft society, the larger craft society that then supports, say for instance, the home building in India. When you take that understanding of a craft society that encircles craftspersons, where do you see that falling in your own reclamation of a Detroit home? So we clearly fall within an industrialized city, maybe one that isn't highly functioning, but it is certainly an industrialized city. So after you did it yourself, where do you see this possibly going with that craft society diagram in mind?
So actually, the people who reclaim material from houses need to undergo specialized training to be able to salvage material with minimum harm. And one in the, I forget the Detroit blight report, removal report, sorry, I forget what it's called exactly. Sorry. Oh no, this is in my new laptop. It has nothing on it, sorry. The Detroit Blight Removal Task Force report from 2014, one of the advantages or benefits of reclaiming material was that it created skilled jobs for people in the city. So that would form definitely that is an important part that is recognized, or important part of reclaiming material which is recognized. And that's actually a good question. I should look at this. Okay, this diagram isn't legible to you, so but those arrows here which go from the reclaimer to technology are sort of indicative of that aspect of reclaiming materials where they need to undergo specialized training, and it's a specialized skill in that larger industrialized society.
And also the crafts society might have to receive the same type of training from the computational side, or at least it needs to be automated in such a way. Follow what I'm saying?
I'm not exactly
right.
right.
Reclaiming material, but then you have to use computation to maximize it, to upcycle it. So there's
Okay, right.
kind of a specialized piece of knowledge there as well. So I don't know how that ultimately translates
Right.
to a larger kind of culture.
Right. I mean, in this diagram, I've just burdened the designer with doing that. But yeah, that's arguably, I mean, that is that a new skill which designers in general need to be trained with or not? Is, I mean, that's a great question.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Sorry. The diagrams?
Yeah.
AutoCAD.